It's time for the chip race.
For strategy this week, we are joined by former guest and the newly crowned WPT champion, Soheb Porbandarwala. Soheb, first up, huge congratulations on that result.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be back on.
It's so great to have you. It was a 3,500 buy-in and you got, I think, 240k for the win. I watched the final table and it looked like you didn't put a foot wrong. I have one question though before we start. In this hand, spoiler alert, you win with Seven-Deuce offsuit. Had you and your opponent, Balakrishna, agreed to play the Seven-Deuce game for the entire final table, or was it just for heads up?
There was nothing official. But if you saw the heads up, there was some clear back and forth going on with terms of trying to outplay the other person and like trying to run some unorthodox lines. But no, we weren't playing the Seven-Deuce game. It just seemed that way.
Well, let's get to the hand. As I said, it comes from heads up play on that WPT final table. You have a commanding lead after your opponent, Balakrishna Patur, 5-bet shove Queen 7 into your kings, helping tell that story you told us a moment ago about how there was some wild back and forth. The blinds are 2.5 million, 5 million with a 625k ante. Balakrishna has 15.5 big blinds and is the effective stack. He limps with the 10-8 of diamonds and you check behind with the 7 of diamonds, 2 of hearts. That all seems pretty reasonable, so let's get to the flop, which comes 8 of hearts, 7 of clubs, 3 of hearts. It goes check. Bet 5.5 million from Balakrishna into 11.25 million, just under 50%, and call. Again, both plays feel pretty standard.
It's a very standard hand. What are you going to do?
Dara, in a limp pot, both players have super wide ranges. So in this spot, who really has the advantage on this texture?
I think both ranges are actually very, very similar.
Yeah.
And actually, when I put this into the solver, I actually literally gave them exactly the same range, missing the top, which obviously the button would probably raise or do something else other with limp, and missing maybe some of the absolute bottom, which he might fold. Similarly, in Soheb's spot, he would presumably raise his stronger hands and try and get it in. So he's missing top of range as well.
Just to kind of expand on that a little, when we were 16 to 18 big blinds deep, affected the other way, when I was short, he had limped on the button with ace queen off. So there was definitely, in my mind, like some mixing on his part. Like I don't know if he would do it when he was in that spot, but when I ran it later, I gave him like a little mix between like limp calling all-ins or raising and shoving all in.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. He has to limp some of his stronger hands too. He can't just cap his range.
So I did like some limping with 9s plus. Maybe that's too wide.
The interesting thing for me when I ran it was, even though I gave you both identical ranges, it just kind of shows the power of position that on this particular flop, he still has a 55-45 equity range advantage by virtue of being in position. Because obviously you're going to have to check fold some hands which he can consider checking behind, or he can bluff with, etc. So being out of position, even though your range is at least as strong as his range, you do have to sort of proceed carefully on the flop.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Actually, thinking about it there, you're probably going to split your range with maybe a few traps of the very top stuff. And then the next category down are going to be the ones that you're happy to get in. And then you've got your category of hands where you want to limp in and maybe call a couple of those, and maybe somewhere you're going to limp fold. And then some, of course, that you might actually throw away to begin with. Anyway, let's get to the turn, because this is where the hand gets a little bit more interesting. It comes the ace of hearts, completing the flop flush draw. The board now reads 8 of hearts, 7 of clubs, 3 of hearts, ace of hearts. The action goes check, check here. So the ace is less interesting than it might seem, because one would assume that a lot of the ace-x hands get in pre at this stack depth, although, as you said, you felt like there could be some mixing.
Ace felt more like a blank card than most other cards that would have fallen, especially the ace of hearts when he checks back.
Yeah, I agree with that. It being a flush completer is probably a bit more interesting. You guys probably have a similar number of flushes in this spot, but overall, given that our opponent can stab the flop pretty wide, but you can only really call with some equity, it probably is true that the range advantage has switched slightly to your favor. Your hand, however, does seem to be bang in that check call zone in the middle. Was that your intention on this street?
If he bet, I was probably going to call, I think, but I'm not really sure what I would have done. It kind of would have depended on his sizing, because like he should be firing that ace pretty wide. I might have folded, honestly. I mean, like, I don't consider my flush draw to be good if it hits. I mean, it might be, but I don't really like want to use the deuce of hearts as like my get there card.
Well, that brings up a great point, Dara, because with the 10-8 of diamonds, the question is, should Balakrishna be checking or betting after Soheb checks? Obviously, this ace is something he could perhaps represent, given that he has already planted the seed in Soheb's mind that he could have some ace-x.
Yeah, I think this hand does kind of make a natural bet. I think after the flop goes check, bet, call, as you mentioned, Soheb's range is strengthened and Villain's range is not particularly strengthened. So going into the turn, it's kind of flipped around and Soheb now has a slight range advantage. But with the particular hand of 10-8 suited, it just kind of makes sense to bet. I looked at this in the solver. The solver mixes, but it mostly bets. And it uses a 66% sizing, which I think does sort of give you a somewhat difficult decision with a lot of hands, including the hand that you have.
Yeah, I mean, if he bet 66%, I probably would have folded. I wouldn't want him to get back into the heads-up match, like with me, like calling him down, like being a hero. But I'd be okay with him getting back into the heads-up match if I shoved and he was a hero.
Yeah, it is a bit dark tunnely to take that line. Well, to the river, it comes the 9 of clubs. Definitely an interesting card. The final board is the 8 of hearts, 7 of clubs, 3 of hearts, ace of hearts, 9 of clubs. And the pot is 22.25 million. So have you checked, presumably thinking that you're good a lot and expecting a decent number of give-ups. However, Balakrishna bets 11 million, deciding that his 8 is going to target, I guess, some 7x and maybe even 3x hands in your range for value. Dara, that just seems way too thin to me. Is it?
Yeah, I think it is too thin. Another thing worth noting here is that after the turn goes check, check, Villain has effectively weakened his range again. So going to the river, Soheb actually has a fairly reasonable range advantage. And 10-8 doesn't feel good enough really to get value from too many stronger hands. Yeah, so I don't think it actually makes sense for Villain to bet here.
When he bet, when I saw it later, I was surprised that he had an 8 and not a 9. But I guess they're kind of the same. But like the 9 also fits a good portion of my check calling range with like open enders and stuff on the flop. So I'm not folding a 9 on the river. So I think his bet was too thin with an 8. But when he bet, I did think he was betting for thin value because, I mean, we'd been playing for a while, heads up, and like the whole day and the previous day as well. So I had seen him bet for thin value on rivers against me and against others. And with his sizing, it just seemed like such a great spot to take advantage of that.
Yeah, the thing about thin value bets is like they can be effective against weaker opposition who won't find enough bluff raises. But against stronger opposition, you really have to be very careful because you are opening the door for the bluff check raise. The whole point about the river bluff check raise is generally it's a hand which is strong enough to win at showdown if it goes check, check. But when the villain bets, we don't really have enough showdown. But since we have something like a pair which is blocking some of his strong hands, we have a good hand to turn into a bluff raise. Now, a lot of live players don't really think like that. They really only consider calling or folding in these spots. Whereas, you know, someone like Soheb will take in inverted commas, a made hand and turn it into a bluff.
Well, that's a great point. And actually, the point also about Soheb, you having a lot of 9x in your range, I think that's absolutely right. You can definitely have Jack 9 here. You could have 9-5 here. Those hands do make an awful lot of sense. You're both a pair of spoilers because you've sort of semi-revealed what's about to happen. But here we go anyway. The action is back on you, Soheb. You obviously have an okay bluff catcher. It's pretty close, actually. It might be reasonable enough to call. Fold wouldn't seem terrible either. You did, however, have other ideas, Soheb. You shipped it all in for 67.4 million, laying Balakrishna about 1.8 to 1, 56.4 million to win 157.05 million. Could you talk us through your thought process?
Yeah, I think Pio said mostly call here, but I just thought in that spot that I was beat too often by that exact player. He definitely can't have flushes. He can have some straights, but like I'm not sure if he's betting Jack 10 on the flop, like for 9% of his stack or whatever. It might just be better for him to check with Jack 10 there. So not only could I have shoved flushes for value, I could have shoved all the straights and 2 pairs for value there, knowing he can't really have a flush. So knowing that like I hadn't made any river bluffs against him, like all of our interactions and like out of line hands had been like pre-flop and on the flop with 4-bets and stuff. So I felt like I definitely had some room to maneuver on the river when he bet. And I assumed he bet for value, but not with the top of what he could have. It was really mostly just range advantage.
Dara, this may look to many as a sort of wild move. Is it solver approved? And how important was it that Soheb had a heart in his hand?
Yeah, it's solver approved in the sense that solver does this some of the time. If we did this all of the time with these types of hands, then we're going to end up over bluffing in this spot. If we're playing against somebody who's playing, let's say, an equilibrium strategy, so when Soheb checks, they're betting the appropriate hands for value and they're balancing with the appropriate number of bluffs, then we're definitely over bluffing if we check raise every time. But the solver mixes, actually, it does all three options with 7-2 off. It sometimes raises, it sometimes calls, and it sometimes folds. But that's against a player playing a balanced equilibrium strategy. We already know that this player has bet a hand which he shouldn't have bet. So he has too many thin value hands. When you're up against somebody who has too many thin value bets, calling makes less sense because we're obviously not beating those thin value bets with 7-2 off. But raising makes more sense because their betting range is too weak and has a significant chunk of it that's thin value bets that can't face up to a raise. So I think against this specific opponent, it actually makes perfect sense to pure raise this hand. As I said, the solver does mix all three. It never raises without a heart in its hand. It wants to have a heart, but once it does have a heart, it sometimes raises, sometimes calls, sometimes folds.
Well, you had a heart, but you also had the heart to stick this one in, and you were obviously risking him getting right back into the match had he found a call. So is Dara's analysis that is very solver based, in essence playing out your logic at the time, which is that you were up against a player with whom you were sort of playing street poker and you could kind of out level him in this spot by thinking, well, actually, he is going to try and value bet me way too thin here. And this is a spot where he's opened the door.
Yeah, definitely. But in game, my thought process was mostly, okay, I'm all in. How can he call? How can he call? How can he call? Yeah, I mean, just knowing his tendencies and knowing that like it would be very tough for him to have a bet calling hand after checking back the turn. It seemed like a one pair hand, like at best a two pair hand. I assume he calls with two pair, but knowing that he would bet one pair, especially a 9.
Well, you have summed that up perfectly. Balakrishna has to be good about 36% of the time here, and having value bet a hand he just simply shouldn't have. He's way too low in his range to consider a call, and the move does work. This pot put you on the brink of victory. In fact, I think it was 2 hands later when he shoved 10 bigs with king 6 suited, and you held with ace queen to take down the title. I feel like the big takeaway here, alluding back to what Dara said earlier, is how a poor value bet is not just a bet that is too thin, targeting too few hands, which this hand is clearly a good example of, but also one that opens the door for a good thinking opponent to turn their hand, in this case a value hand, into a bluff. I really appreciate you bringing this one to us. Dara, thank you so much for your analysis. And Soheb, congratulations once again. And thank you for bringing what I guess has turned out to be a very pivotal hand.
Thanks for having me on again.
Our pleasure. Thanks, Soheb.